Welcome to the Georgia Archives virtual lunch and learn program. I'm Penny Cliff, the education specialist here at the Archives. We are so glad that you have joined us to watch our August presentation. Our lunch and learn programs are held on the second Friday of the month, and we're sponsored by Friends of Georgia Archives and History. During this pandemic, we want to offer you lunch and learn programs safely in virtual format. I am so pleased to introduce someone many of you know, Kenneth Thomas Jr., or Ken. Ken's program is Family Legends and Stories, What to Believe. On our website, we will also have handouts. Just go to the program section and they'll be right there. Ken is a native of Columbus, Georgia, and a graduate of Emory University. He's had an interest in genealogy since the early 1960s when he was in high school. From 1973 until his retirement in 2006, he was historian in the Historic Preservation Division of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources in Atlanta, working with the National Register of Historic Places. Through his work on genealogy of Governor and President Jimmy Carter, his genealogy expertise came to the attention of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution staff, and thus the column was born. As of 2020, for 43 years, it is the longest running genealogy column in the United States. Ken has published 2 books, Columbus, Georgia in Vintage Postcards and Fort Benning, Images of America series. He has served or is serving on numerous boards, including the Georgia Historical Society, the DEKALB History Center, the Wren's Nest, Friends of Georgia Archives and History, Georgia Postcard Club President, and Georgia Professional Genealogists. Ken became a fellow of the Society of Georgia Archivists in 2009. He is the recipient of numerous awards. The Governor's Award in the Humanities, the Sarah Turner Butler Heritage Award from the Historic Columbus Foundation, the Georgia Historical Society's John McPherson Berrien Lifetime Achievement Award, a Lifetime Achievement Legacy Award from Historic Westville, Georgia Historical Records Advisory Council Award, National Genealogical Society's The President's Citation, and several awards for advocacy. Ken has a genealogy website and is a frequent lecturer on genealogy and history. He lives in Decatur, Georgia. Welcome, Ken.
It's good to be here, everybody, and to cover this topic, Family Legends and Stories, What to Believe. This is one of my favorite topics because a lot of my examples are from my own family that came along very early in my career in genealogy, as Penny mentioned. There are a lot of great family myths that cover many different families, and I'm just bringing a few of those to your attention here. There's a 3 brothers story that one brother came to this country and went north, one went south, and one went west. We shouldn't be believing that. That was something people really thought a lot about earlier, but I think it was just another one of the myths that crept into family stories. A lot of people think their ancestors was an Indian princess or any kind of an Indian or Native American. This is proven very hard to prove on any angle, and I suggest you look elsewhere in your genealogy for the real truth about who your ancestors are. And then a lot of people think we are kin to somebody prominent because we have the same last name. I know my grandmother was a Russell, and she always told me early on that we were kin to Senator Russell. And then I met Senator Russell's niece at a meeting and learned that it was a whole different family. And so you can't just take somebody's name and say we're kin to them without doing further research. Obviously, well-known people do have relatives. And when I worked on President Carter's genealogy, same thing happened. A lot of people claimed kin to him, and especially his mother, who was a Gordy, but it turned out some people really were related and provided some very good information, but an awful lot of people were not. Another myth is our ancestors were wealthy in the old country. And of course, as one friend in Savannah said, it was from a very old lineage. He said, if my ancestor had anything going for him in the old country, he would not have left. So if you were wealthy, you most likely didn't come over here unless somebody gave you a whole colony or something. The records burned, so we can't prove anything. A lot of people say records burned in order to just close off further inquiry. So be very careful if you've ever got that kind of story in your family, because it oftentimes is not true. And most people that say that have no clue about records, whether it was any fire or whether the record important, whether it was even a record. I'll show you an example in a minute, a record of something that never did happen. So it couldn't have burned because it never was there in the first place. And then another one, a very famous one now, is our family name has never changed spelling. And we're learning through DNA testing, especially, that many names have many different spellings, and you've got to roll with the flow. That your ancestor's name or your ancestral surname could easily have changed spelling many times, and you can't, don't go carve it in stone anywhere, because saying that it never changed. A story can hinge on a word. It's very important when you interview people, and a lot of this lectures relate to interviewing. It's very important to be sure that you don't change the wording or the expression that somebody made. I know my friend Jack Atkinson, my college roommate, he had a letter that his great grandmother's sister, his great aunt, wrote him. And the lady said that his great grandmother was divorced from her first husband, separated from her second husband, divorced from the third husband, and widowed by the fourth husband. So which one of these created provable documents? So in dissecting his family tale, it turns out that separation did not mean a divorce. And today people use the word separation very loosely, but there's no record created at the courthouse for separation, whereas a divorce should create a record, and that's something he should have been able to prove. And that's one of the things you got to be careful what you read, because he had it in writing, but the lady was very serious in what she was saying. Is your story written or oral? If it's written down, did the person writing it have any personal knowledge of the story? Did she really know any of the facts from her own account, his own account, or were they repeating their parents' or grandparents' stories and changing things? Whenever a story is repeated, it's going to have some changes or modernizations. Compare the dates of their life and their awareness with the time covered in the story or the family tale. If they couldn't have known it firsthand, then from whom did they get it? And that's what, of course, you assume they got it from a parent or whatever. My great aunt Julia, born in 1904, wrote me a letter in 1964 outlining my Thomas family in Charlotte, North Carolina. She did so at my request just as soon as I was beginning my genealogy work. She typed the data that she pulled together in 1964, but was it true? And here's the letter in the middle of the slide. She was only age 60. Of course, that doesn't seem very old now, but when you're only 15 or so and your great aunt is 60, you think that's a very old senior member of the family. But I learned quickly when I looked at the records that she obviously did not know or did not want to tell me the real story, that her mother didn't even get married to Mr. Thomas till my grandfather was 10 years old. And Aunt Julia just never wanted to talk about what her mother's life had been before her mother had married her father and begot her and two younger siblings. This is my great-grandmother on the right, and she had a pretty colorful career with her first situation. Then she married Jack Thomas and had 3 more children. But what Aunt Julia typed up here in the middle here in this letter just glosses over everything. And so you have to be careful, because even though Aunt Julia wrote it to me, later on when I tried to prove it, that's when the real story was revealed. And if you're going to find out things like this, try to get somebody to put it in writing. You can type it up yourself, and if you do it an email, please print it out and put it in your file so there's another record. It does pay to write people letters and ask them to provide you information to get it in writing, as I did on the previous story, because I wanted that person who knew the story to tell it to me. And even though I might have a phone conversation with her, having it in writing was very important. And if you do get a letter from someone and put it in your files, don't write on the original. Make your copy if you want to make annotations, because the original becomes a document on its own. And I've had several people, when their parents have died, they found the letters I wrote their parent. So it's important to write people. And so it's in their possession, whether they write you back or not, because it could be that that letter brings that family back to you after they passed on, and you can confer with the next generation. That's one way to keep the connections going. We always rely on family Bibles, and this is a Bible that turned up recently. It's a family I looked up. In fact, my first visit to the Georgia Archives in 1963, I looked up the marriage of my ancestor, William Snellings, and his wife, Elizabeth Pickard, 1805 or 6 or somewhere date like that. It was in a book that has since, it was a typescript, and the book that it was made from has since shredded. I mean, just, what do you call it, dissolved, because it was so fragile. So this is a Bible that turned up when a guy went out to a family cemetery in the Columbus area and knocked on the door of the people where the cemetery was in their yard. And they said, yeah, that's our family out there. Or anyway, they had the family Bible, and this is what he scanned. And the family Bible, when you compare the Bible record to actual newspaper notices, on the upper left, we have Nancy Pickard, my Revolutionary War ancestor's wife, and she, my ancestor, is too. And they say she died in 1839, and yet the newspaper points out she died in 1838, so the Bible is incorrect. Then the second death down there is John H. Pickard, my Revolutionary War ancestor, and we have a date, so is that accurate? How do we know? Because the only proof we have of that is, of course, the Bible. The other dates on the right-hand side in the next page are accurate based on other things and do match the tombstones, but it just shows you, even with a family Bible, you have to really take it with a grain of salt, because they may not have written it down the moment it happened. It may be years later. They may be copying a previous Bible. And always when you do a copy of a family Bible, if you're going to get a Xerox of it, you want to make sure you know when that particular Bible was published. And that helps you decide whether the information entered in the Bible was at the time that the events occurred, contemporary, or were they done much later. So always do that when you're getting a family Bible record. Families without any research. When I started doing my genealogy, my grandmother was a fairly young grandmother. She was only about 41 when I was born. So in the 60s, she was just turning 60 some odd herself. But she had 3 older sisters. And they made a point that they didn't know when their mother was born because her birth certificate or birth record had burned had been lost in the Columbus courthouse when it burned. And it turned out my great grandmother was born around 1868 because I found her in the 1870 census. But what's wrong with that statement? A, Georgia did not have recorded births until 1918 at the state level. That's earlier than the official date of 1919, but there are people from Columbus with births in 1918. B, Columbus, Georgia started local birth records in 1890. C, there'd been no courthouse fire in Columbus, Georgia since 1838. And so D, the truth there was no public record from 1868 to burn. So these ladies just made up an excuse for why they didn't know when their mother was born. And of course, they got her tombstone wrong and all the family stories were wrong because they just made up something. So you always got to look at what people tell you and go back and try to prove whether it's correct or not, or has any grain of truth. It's always good to create a timeline on somebody's life. This is my great-grandfather, Joe Brooks. He died in 1918. Of course, given the pandemic we're in now, and the pandemic 100 years ago in 1918, for a long time I thought he died due to the Spanish flu, but it turned out he died of other causes. And when you lay out his life and look at the different records that were created that you can document his existence through, you had the census records, 1880, 1900, and 1910, the World War I draft. He signed his World War I draft registration card 1 week before he died. And his signature matches that of his son, my grandfather, very similar, showing my grandfather was taught by him to actually write. And of course, you have Joe Brooks's obituary and his tombstone. And what other records could come from his lifetime? He lived he ran a country store. He'd been a farmer before that, but there are not too many other things we have because he didn't live about 45 years. But by laying the records over what he might have met and caused to be created in his lifetime, you might have a better chance of knowing all the facts that can be added to the story if you're trying to create a narrative on Joe Brooks's life. And there are plenty of pictures of him as well. This is a little memoir a friend of mine sent, just a cousin. She sent this in 2017. And her ancestor, C.A. George, Charlotte George, he wrote this down. And it's really great to have a little memoir that your own ancestor wrote. So he says, my earliest recollection was the burning of my wrist with a flat iron. Being a reminiscent mind, I go back to Cuthbert, Georgia. As tradition has it, I was born in Chattahoochee County, August 26th. He doesn't give a year. My father and mother must have moved to Randolph County, that's the next county over, that fall or winter, taking with them my oldest brother, Will, who was born in Green Hill, Chattahoochee County. Then in 1858 was when the brother apparently was born, and myself making a family of 4. Then he moved to Grandfather McNeil's plantation. This is great detail. Of course, he's writing all this stuff in his earliest years, so how much of this could he remember on his own, or how much should the family reinforce it by retelling things? But the neat thing is at the very end, he says, at the age of 4, he remembers seeing the soldiers, meaning the Confederate soldiers, coming home from the war. I was at the shanties at the time, and they were aboard the Fort Gaines train. All this local locations matter because they're all down in South Georgia, south of Columbus. You find Charlie George's tombstone and find a grave, and he was born in 1861 and died in 1942. So at the time the soldiers returned from the Civil War, he was not quite 4 years old. So could somebody 4 years old really remember this or not? He clearly has a good story, and most of the stuff can be documented just from the family's, the rest of the story in the family. But could anybody 4 years old really remember this and write it down as an old man? I'm not sure how old he was when he wrote this down, but he was probably in his 60s when he wrote down this memoir. So you got to take something with a grain of salt. It's got some really good details, and great if it's your ancestor. This is one of my North Carolina ancestors, George Hoyle. And of course, I never met him. He died 20 years before I was born, but the family had two different things about him. One, that he had lost his arm in a threshing accident. And when I interviewed his descendants, his grandchildren, they all remembered the story. Some of them remembered him with his one arm. And then he was a moonshiner. And I never thought I'd be able to identify this and document the date these things occurred. It just never occurred to me. Then on newspapers.com, one of the great newspaper sites, one night I was just searching for him. And in North Carolina, like a lot of the states, the newspapers pick up news and print it all over the state. So you might have something like an Atlanta Journal that came from South Georgia where they just repeated it because it was an interesting story. So here in North Carolina, the Durham paper, way east of Charlotte, and this man lived west of Charlotte, says that George Hoyle from Catawba County was drunk. So here we were sympathetic that he had lost his arm and fallen. I just thought he fell into the threshing machine, but apparently he was drunk as a skunk. Fooling around a threshing machine, his arm was cut to pieces, and they had to call in two doctors to sever his arm to save him. Now, this little notice was printed in 50 newspapers across the state of North Carolina. I'm sure if you got back to the original newspaper that they're quoting here, Shelby, then you might find a much longer story about his predicament. So what do you do when you're no longer a farmer? If you've lost an arm, you go to moonshining. And I never thought I'd document the exact date because I was trying to find some kind of federal court case over being a moonshiner. So in the next year's paper, this one appeared in Asheville. Remember, he lived near Charlotte, so Asheville's a good ways away. And the Asheville Democrat said in 1890 that the federal agents, the revenuers, had been out there and had arrested several men, moonshiners of the South Mountains. And there's George Hoyle at the bottom. The actual article lists several more men that they picked up. And I might be able to find a federal court case with one of the other men, maybe as the defendant, since George Hoyle's name didn't show up. But this just goes to show you that you never need to think you can't find something. The newspapers are so much more available now than ever before, so much more scanned and digitized and searchable. So always go back and look and do different configurations, someone's name, place, or just part of their name. If it's an unusual name, just look for the surname. Don't even worry about a first name because you could easily find some good juicy tidbit to document your family story. Memory versus history. Memory is what you were told or was passed down. History is what you can be proven using documents, records, and sources. A family story is a memory. It can be written or oral, and if oral has a greater chance of changing over time as you pass it down, being modernized, cleaned up, edited to save face, etc., or now to make it politically correct. We're very bad now in trying to update our family thinking, especially our ancestors' political thinking, and making it politically correct. And one story I have that I hope to get published someday is we have a family story of the Upchurch relatives going to Texas in 1865 and turning around and coming back after a few years. And they got back to Georgia before the 1870 census. So if this lady had not written this down as an old lady in 1948, we would never know that this family actually went west in several years and then turned around and returned to Georgia. And she wrote a whole memoir about this, but she wrote it down as an old lady. So how accurate is her thing? That's why I want to publish this as an article in a genealogy journal to point out what we've learned about the story and how accurate she really was, even remembering as an old lady about 85 to 90 years old. Dr. Gates is, of course, well known for the TV series about genealogy, Finding Your Roots, but he said this the other day, well, a year ago now, family stories are notoriously unreliable. And he knows as well as I do that that's what you got to be careful of. You want to write the story down or have it sent to you in writing, but you got to be very careful to take everything with a grain of salt. One of my families in North Carolina, the Christenberry family, I had some letters back in the 60s from a lady named Alma Henderson, who was my grandmother's second cousin, twice second cousin. She was related to us in many ways. And she wrote me 2 letters. I'd ask her who the ancestor William P. Christenberry's wife was, the first wife. And in her first letter, she says it's Mary Holton, and the second wife was Fanny Gilden. And then a year later, she wrote me again, and this time she switched her mind around and says that the first wife is Fanny Holden, and the second wife is Mary McGarr. And I contributed this to a family book that was published in 1988 on the Christenberry family. So I have now contributed this information, which we don't know if it's documented or not. Alma gave no sources, and then Alma died. The next letter, after Alma sent me these several letters, the next letter was from her daughter announcing her death. So I never got to question Alma, her sources, or get any further information. So sometimes you may be doing good things thinking I'll contribute this to the book, and now you realize that you may be the source of information that's unproven. So I'm still working on this story, trying to prove where Alma got it from. And I think she was accurate, but she didn't tell us how she was accurate. Where errors creep in. Like I said, published books like the one I just mentioned, where I unintentionally gave information that wasn't documented. And a lot of the earlier published family histories were notorious for putting things in without documentation or without anybody really thinking through what they were saying. Historical markers. One of the things I did when I worked with the Georgia DNR, we were on the marker committee, and on various other times I've been on marker committee advisory groups. And everything on the historical marker has to be trimmed down to fit. And you got to be very careful when you read markers or when you try to write a marker, because every adjective counts. And you can't just say, well, let's just squeeze it into a postcard to make it sound good, because the wording on it, and then future generations think it's perfect. And a lot of times there've been a lot of errors committed there. Online errors. Anything you do gets online nowadays. Going back to the Christenberry family, those tidbits of those two ladies' names are there. To correct them will not be possible. This stuff is out there forever now, so you got to be very careful. Sometimes logic is not applied by the person repeating the information. That's why you want to have a timeline or some other way to corroborate some information. The family member could be very biased. I'm going to show you some slides in a minute about a very biased cousin who was morally biased. She didn't like to talk about anybody that had created a moral issue. And so she does her answer to that, where she just left them out and pretend like they never existed. You can collect different versions of the same story, and then you got to sort out which one could be the truth, or could all the pieces of the story be true, just in a different manner than maybe the way the story comes across straightforwardly. And why would someone make up a fact? To avoid embarrassment? I mean, most people didn't go around saying grandma had children out of wedlock when grandma did. Don't really know. Sometimes a lot of my relatives just made up things, like I said, about the birth rate, because they didn't know. And most people don't want to admit they didn't know or never had any inquisitive nature to ask any questions. They just didn't, they just made something up to fill in the gap. And everybody generally wants their family to be higher up the economic scale than their family really was. So very few people will say, well, we were just poor dirt farmers. They always want to get a plantation involved or something and make the story a little bit better than the reality might have been. This is the lady that omitted people, cousin LOUISE DANIEL of Columbus. She was a single lady, and she had a lot of prejudices. In typing up the Wynn family, we have her letters now. One of our other cousins has them. She implied that cousin Flossie Kilpatrick had never married. And we assumed she knew because she was older. She was born in 1892. And she mentioned that Jenny Kilpatrick's descendant, living in 1935, had died and left a grandchild. And she said that this grandchild was the last of the line for the branch of my ancestor's sister, Mattie Wynn Kilpatrick. But by chance, I ran across somebody that actually knew the grandchild, who lived in outside of Orlando. And another cousin went to see this lady in 1985, and she said that she had no children. She was clearly the last of the line, as far as she knew. In her baby book, the cousin went to see her. She showed him her baby book and said, look at all these nice things that were sent to me when I was born. And he was attracted to one card that said birth announcement, thank you card, saying Uncle Thomas. So who was Uncle Thomas? And that was his first name. And it turns out that the lady had eliminated from the family tree Flossie Kilpatrick. We mentioned on the previous slide, because she had actually married the mayor of Savannah, Thomas Gamble. And he did a number of books on history and genealogy. The books here at the Georgia Archives, his papers are in Savannah at the Georgia Historical Society and been at the Savannah Public Library. He was a newspaper columnist and quite a well-known author. He did a family history in 1906, which he mentions. He had actually interviewed his wife's grandmother, Mattie William Kirkpatrick. He got details about them being from Hancock County and the maiden name of her mother, things that we proved later, but now we know that he knew that in 1906. So why was this marriage to Flossie not on the family tree? Turns out that they were Catholic and they separated. And Cousin Flossie went to Asheville to take the vapors or whatever people do up there and separated from her husband. But because they were Catholic, they never divorced. This lady couldn't stand that moral transgression in her mind, so she just left them out of the family tree as if the lady had never married or anything. So that's why you've got to root out everybody in the tree if it's important enough to you to figure out what really happened to them. With all the records that are now available on Ancestry.com and Family Search, it's not that hard to prove certainly what happened to anybody in the 20th century. And that's why you need to make sure you've documented everybody. And if they're dead, you need to prove they're dead and not just rely on some older cousin who had her prejudices like we did for a long time. These are some things about how to interview people. There's the Oral History Association with its website. It's a national association, and they have annual meetings and I assume a lot of publications. For a list of questions, you could go to thoughtco.com, where they have 50 questions you could use to interview your relatives. If you're going to do some interviewing, preserve it on a tape, or if you're going to do it by phone, you need to type it up later on the best you can. I have actually taped people on the phone. May not have been legal, but I did it just to be able to write a memo later. Share a copy of your interview with somebody else so that you're not the only one with the copy, especially if it's a very important interview. And then donate a copy to the local historical society, genealogical society, archives, or whoever might take it, just so there's more than one copy around. And if it's worthwhile, try to get it published in order to document that part of a family story. There's some interview projects going on here in the Atlanta area. The Veterans History Project, there's a major one at the Atlanta History Center, where they've been working for years documenting World War II veterans especially. Some other cities have done similar things. I know there was one in Augusta for a while. So look around and see. Most of our World War II veterans are slowly passing away, but you might find that people have interviewed them in the past. And if you have any interviews you've done yourself, you might want to contribute them to that. And then StoryCorps, it's a national program at the Library of Congress. They do have a branch here in Atlanta at the Atlanta History Center. You need to check with them and see how you can work in there to get an interview done, a professional interview done with somebody with a story that's worth recording. It doesn't have to be a family story, it could be an interesting story nonetheless. The DeKalb History Center here in Decatur, Georgia has done for a long time a series called Our Remember Hour. They don't call it that anymore, but we interviewed a lot of civic leaders, a lot of just many general people in the community, judges and teachers and the president of Agnes Scott and various people like that. We had those taped, but they've had those now converted to digitized versions and transcribed. So those are records in our files at the DeKalb History Center. It's a very important way. It's something that other people can do, and you can do in your own community, with your society, whatever group you're with, and try to record some of the local people and the stories on. So, because now time is moving on, a lot of these people are no longer with us. Some frequently asked questions. I've done this particular talk a number of times, and if we have time today, since we don't have an audience, we'll just ask a few more questions. One thing you ought to try to find out is, how did your ancestors meet? And can you document it? How did your own parents meet? How did you meet your own spouse? And make sure your children know that. My parents actually had two slightly different stories about how they met. And I never could quite rationalize, they grew up in the same town, they went to different schools and had some friends in common, but they met at a certain gathering, they claimed. A lot of people ask, did their family have a coat of arms? Or if they have one, is it a valid coat of arms? I had a cousin one time ask me, could she change the colors on her coat of arms when she was painting it, or I think she was actually crocheting it or something like that for her brother when he got married. And I had to tell the poor cousin, I said, well, first of all, you're not entitled to a coat of arms unless you directly descend from the man who got the coat of arms from the crown in England. It's not assigned to your name, and therefore it's probably not valid anyway, so change the colors, it doesn't make any difference. But a lot of people go for this because they think their family was higher up the social hierarchy than they really were. And I would guess that most people are not entitled to any kind of coat of arms, especially if you buy it at a mall in a kiosk somewhere. Can DNA help prove any part of my family history? Yes, it can, and I've used that. And next time I do this show, I'll probably add another thing in there about DNA, but I've definitely proved several family stories through DNA matching up with people with the same name that the family story talked about, and help fill in some of the blanks in our family history. So DNA can help verify a story, or it also can help bring up other questions in your family story. And what do I do if we got several versions of the same story? I have some cousins who are trying to discuss their grandfather who died in 1944 before any of them were of age to know anything. And he was a businessman. He had been gambling, and he was in a car, and there was a car wreck, and he ended up going to the hospital and dying. So the question is, was he murdered? Was the money stolen? Was the driver involved? If you read the newspaper story, it has a few clues. If you read his death certificate, there's a clue. And then you have the different cousins who each one of their own parents told you a little tidbit of the story. So it's worth putting all this together and just saying this is what the descendants of Uncle Joe had to say. And maybe there's a truth. Maybe every piece of the story is true. It's just the way it was interpreted by that particular branch of the family. So don't discard different versions of a family story. Try to pull it all together and see if it can't all be possibly part of the saga that you're trying to document. So those are some of the points I wanted to make. I hope all of you that are reading this listening to this will enjoy analyzing your family legends and stories a little bit more. This lecture is going to be on the Archives channel that you're watching on now. On the YouTube channel, it'll be available in perpetuity. And there's a handout we've included on the site as well that will give you some guidance on some of these points we talked about, and then give you some food for thought for some other questions you might ask. And I thank you very much. That's it.
Ken, thank you so much. We really appreciate everything you've shared with us, and we look forward to having you back.
Be glad to. Yeah.